Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Rogers State University. My name is Paul Eichert, and I'm the Director of Student Development, and I'm very happy to be here this evening with you all for an interesting debate and conversation. Let's see here. I'm going to provide just a few brief introductions so we have some expectations for the evening, and then I'll try to pass it off as quickly as I can so we can get the debate started. I guess the first thing I want to do is thank everyone for being here and also thank the student organizations putting this on. The Student Secular Alliance is a fantastic student org at RSU. They have been incredibly involved in the community and done a lot of work to create opportunities like this so that we can have some intellectual debate around topics that people are passionate about. So it's really excellent. This is our second debate that we're having. And so I want to provide just a quick introduction to Jen Stemmer, our SSA president, and she can introduce our speakers. And then shortly after that, we'll go through the format and expectations and get started.
Hi guys, I'm Jen. I'm the president, as you just said. Thank you so much for being here. It really means a lot that all of you guys came out on a Thursday night to be here. That's really awesome. So for our affirmative, we have Dean Meadows. He graduated the Bear Valley Bible Institute with a bachelor's in theology and Amherst University with a bachelor's in Bible. He's the executive director of the Daily Apologist, and he served 6 years in the Marines with a tour of duty to Iraq in 2006. For our rebuttal, we have Nathaniel Walters. He hails from Orchard, Nebraska, is a former evangelical youth pastor who, after researching the supernatural claims made in religious texts, found no evidence for any gods. Today, he identifies as an agnostic atheist activist, and anti-theist. He is a co-host of the YouTube channel Divine Disbelief and is writing a book exposing the lies and fraudulent activities of young Earth creationists Carl Baugh. He is a Democratic candidate for Texas House District 93, and he and his partner, Susan, live in Arlington, Texas with their two corgis, Stanley and Hibkiss, and Benny Barkington, and their cat, Gypsy Rose. Paul Eichert.
Well, Jen, thanks for doing the introduction for us. I won't say much else because I want us to be able to get started, but our topic for tonight was, did Jesus rise from the grave? And so we're very thankful to have our guests here participate in the debate. Just a couple of ground rules and expectations for the format. The debate will be each speaker will have 20 minutes for an opening statement followed by a 12-minute rebuttal of each. Then we'll move into, each will get an 8-minute and then a 5-minute conclusion. So I think that puts us at about an hour and 15 or hour and 20 minutes. So if you have to get up and use the restroom, anything like that, of course, come and go as need. In terms of house rules, I realize people are passionate, especially when we talk about religion. That's great. I'm assuming that's why everyone is here. Universities are a great place for that kind of clash of ideas and for the exploration of philosophy. So I just ask that everyone be respectful of the speakers that we have and for no interruptions. If we do have any kind of interruption, you'll get kind of a warning and then we'll take it from there. But I expect you guys look like lovely people. We shouldn't have any issues. So if you have questions or comments, though, we do want some engagement. So following the debate, there will be some time for some Q&A with the audience as long as our participants are still willing at that point. So with that, that's kind of our format and our house rules, and I think we can get started. I believe that Dean is up first for a 20-minute opening statement.
Mic check. Y'all hear me okay? All right. You let me know when to go.
Go for it.
I'd like to thank Rogers State University and the Secular Student Alliance for this amazing opportunity to be here tonight to defend the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Jennifer Stemmer, who's been wonderful to dialogue with in preparation for this event. I'd also like to thank Nathaniel for his willingness to come out and dialogue with me on this very important topic. I believe that this very question is the most important question that any of us can answer. Did Jesus rise from the grave? Paul states in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Jesus did not rise from the grave, then Christianity is useless, it's futile, and I could not agree with him more. However, if Jesus did rise from the grave, then Christianity is true. I believe there are at least two ways that one can come to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. The first is the existential. The second is the historical. And so tonight, I am going to focus on the historical case for the resurrection. Now, one preliminary note before we get started with my facts. And it has to do with how we approach the Bible in this evening's debate. Now, I know that Nathaniel and I have a different view on the New Testament. If we don't, it'll be a short debate. And so I also know that there are those in the audience this evening who don't view Scripture the same way that I view Scripture. But I believe that the case for the resurrection is so strong that in tonight's debate, I am not going to appeal to the Bible in the following ways. I will not appeal to divine inspiration of the Bible. I will not appeal to fulfilled prophecy in the Bible. And I will not appeal to inerrancy of Scripture. Nor will I appeal to personal experiences that I've had with my own walk, in my own walk with Jesus Christ. I am simply looking at the New Testament as a collection of ancient documents and seeking to discern the historical facts contained within them, and then looking to see what's the best explanation of the facts. Just as historians look at Roman sources to talk about Rome, just as historians look at Union and Confederate sources to investigate the Civil War, I'm appealing to the earliest Christian sources to see what we can gather about the resurrection. Therefore, I will appeal to the Gospels this evening as Greco-Roman biographies, because if the Gospels can be placed in a specific genre, they most closely resemble this one. Like Greco-Roman biographies, the Gospels are written in continuous narrative form. The stories, the anecdotes, and speeches are combined to form the narrative. The life of the main character is not always covered in chronological order. Attention is focused solely on the main character rather than on the era, events, or the government that's in place. Furthermore, the life of the philosopher or teacher is usually arranged topically in order to display the ideas and the teachings of the main character. Furthermore, the main character is illuminated through his words and deeds as a model for the reader to either emulate or avoid. Also, I will only appeal to New Testament documents which are categorized as the accepted or recognized letters of Paul. They are 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. These restrictions are in place because I want to meet Nathaniel and those who think like Nathaniel where they are this evening and make the case that even with these restrictions, the resurrection is a historical event. Now, with these preliminary points out of the way, I'll now turn to my main argument. In tonight's debate, I propose to defend two main arguments. First, that there are three facts that must be explained by any adequate historical hypothesis. And those facts are the following. 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. 2, shortly after his crucifixion, his disciples believed and proclaimed that they had seen the risen Jesus. And 3, a few years after his death, Paul, an enemy of Christianity, converted to Christianity after encountering what he believed to be the risen Jesus. And then my second argument is that the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the grave. Now let's look at my first main argument, that there are three facts which must be explained by any adequate historical hypothesis. Fact number 1, that Jesus died by crucifixion. The death of Jesus Christ by crucifixion is attested by a multitude of ancient sources. The Roman historian Tacitus states that Nero fastened the guilty of the burning of Rome and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, whose whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Furthermore, Josephus, Lucian, and Marbar Serapion are at least aware of the event. Jesus' execution is reported in all four Gospels and in the recognized writings of Paul the Apostle. His death also appears in the earliest creeds of the early church, the earliest being 1 Corinthians 15, starting in verse 3. Also, something that should be taken into consideration is that there is a very low probability of surviving crucifixion. Josephus records that just based on the scourgings alone before people were hung on the cross, that their veins and arteries became visible. Also, to date, there is only one historical account of someone surviving Roman crucifixion, and it wasn't Jesus. Furthermore, scholars from all stripes agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. Atheist Gerd Ludemann, in The Resurrection of Jesus, History, Experience, and Theology on page 50 states, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. J.D. Crossan, who denies the authenticity of a large majority of Jesus' sayings, states in Jesus, a revolutionary biography, there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. That he was crucified was as sure as anything historical can ever be. In his work, The Passion, the true story of an event that changed human history, Jewish scholar Geza Vermesh states, the Passion of Jesus is a part of history. Skeptical scholar Paula Fredrickson says in her work, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around the Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. Furthermore, if that wasn't enough, the American Medical Association concluded interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. So as we've surveyed the death of Jesus, the evidence shows that Jesus died by crucifixion and that his death is reported by Romans, Jews, is found in the earliest oral creeds of the church and the earliest documents of the church as well. This was a historical event. And the reason that I point to this fact is that based upon my research, I cannot tell whether or not Nathaniel believes that Jesus was a historical figure. Therefore, if fact number one is correct, then Nathaniel needs to answer whether he believes that Jesus was a historical figure, and if he was, does he agree with fact number one? And if he doesn't, why not? Fact number two, shortly after his crucifixion, the disciples believed and proclaimed that they had seen the risen Jesus. Some of the earliest oral creeds found in the New Testament reveal what the earliest teachings of Christianity were in relation to Jesus. One such oral creed is Romans chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, which states, concerning his Son, who is descendant of David according to the flesh, and he was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Scholars such as James Dunn of Durham University and Bart Ehrman of UNC Chapel Hill believe this to be an early creed originating in Jerusalem for the following reasons. There's an antithetical parallelism, which is within the text. The text moves that Jesus was from God, descendant of David, according to the flesh, according to the Spirit. Furthermore, the term Spirit of holiness is nowhere else found in the Pauline corpus, which means most likely Paul is incorporating a creed that he received. Also, the term Spirit of holiness reflects a pattern of Aramaic and Hebrew phraseology more so than Greek phraseology, and Ehrman concludes that this most likely goes back to the earliest creeds handed down in Aramaic, as he says, the language of Jesus and his earliest disciples. Another oral creed that is seen in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 through 7, in which Paul writes, for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scripture, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, then that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then all the apostles. Now, how do we know that this is a creedal statement? Notice in the passage that Paul's use of delivered and received indicate that Paul is handing down something that he got from someone else. As with Romans chapter 1, verse 3 and 4, there are non-Pauline traits that accompany this section. The term "for our sins" is absent elsewhere in Paul's writings, with the lone exception of Galatians chapter 1, verse 14. Paul doesn't prefer "for our sins." Paul prefers the term "sin." The phrase "according to the Scriptures" is also absent in the Pauline corpus, and that the same is true for the phrase "the 12." Furthermore, and I don't have time to go through all of them, there are parallelisms littered throughout the text. So, given Paul's use of delivering and receiving terminology, along with the other factors seen in this section, we can demonstrate that this is a oral creed. Now, how do we know that this is early? Well, Jesus was crucified around AD 30. In AD 33, Paul became a Christian. In Galatians chapter 1:18, Paul mentions that 3 years after his conversion, he went to Jerusalem to see Peter and James. This means that Paul visited Jerusalem in AD 36. Paul's term here for visit is historio, which literally means to investigate. In other words, Paul didn't go up to Jerusalem to talk about the weather or Oklahoma football. This suggests that Paul went up to get information about the faith from the pillars of the church who are also eyewitnesses. The upshot of this is that since Paul visited in AD 36, it means that the creedal statement that he passed on was around prior to AD 36, within 5 years of Jesus' death on the cross. Another supplemental fact to point number 2 is that the nature of the appearances support the disciples' belief that Jesus rose from the dead. The appearance accounts in the Gospels are polymodal in nature. What do I mean by that? It means that Jesus appeared at different times, at different places, with different people, and engaged in different activities. Luke records that Jesus appeared with 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. John records that Jesus appeared to the 12 indoors and encountered the doubting one, Thomas. John also records that Jesus was making breakfast by the Sea of Galilee for 7 disciples towards the end of his gospel. And 1 Corinthians 15 states that Jesus appeared to 500 people at the same time. Now, in accordance with fact number 1, scholars from all stripes, I repeat, all stripes, agree with fact number 2. Once again, Gerd Ludemann, an atheist, states in What Really Happened, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. In his work, The Foundation of the New Testament Christology, theologian Reginald Fuller from Cambridge states, the disciples thought that they had witnessed Jesus' appearance. However, they are explained is a fact which both believer and unbeliever may agree. Once again, Paul Fredrickson states, I know in their own terms they saw, what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say. And then all the historical evidence we have afterwards attests that to that conviction, that that's what they saw. Now, I'm not saying they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know, as a historian, they must have seen something. Now, the willingness for the earliest apostles or earliest disciples to suffer and die testifies to their sincerity in that belief. It does not prove the resurrection, but it shows that they were in a position to know whether or not what they saw was absolutely true or absolutely false. They are not like us today in our position, or some other martyrs from some other religion today that get stuff secondhand. They were in a prime position to know whether or not what they saw was true. So the nexus of their willingness to suffer or die stems from the centrality of the resurrection and appearance of Jesus. Thus, given the earliest sources, namely the creeds of the infant church, we see the disciples believed and proclaimed that Jesus rose from the grave. Furthermore, it's historically accurate to state that the earliest disciples were willing to suffer and die for what they believed in, thus testifying to the sincerity of their belief. Moving on, fact number 3. Within a few years of Jesus' death, Paul, an enemy of the early church, was converted to Christianity after having an experience in which he believed he saw the risen Jesus. Sticking with the Pauline corpus that I laid out in my introduction, in 1 Corinthians 15:8, Paul states, "Last of all, as one untimely born, he, Jesus, also appeared to me." In 1 Corinthians 9:1, he says, "Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord?" Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, as Paul talks about his ministry, he states, "But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me to his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might preach among the Gentiles." The majority of scholars believe that Paul believed that he had seen the post-resurrected Jesus while traveling to Damascus to persecute Christians. So here's the conclusion to my first argument in summary, that Jesus died by crucifixion. Shortly after his crucifixion, his disciples believed and proclaimed that they had seen the risen Jesus. And then within a few years of Jesus' death, Paul, an enemy of the church, converted after experiencing what he believed to be an experience with the risen Jesus. Now let me move on to argument number 2. The best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the grave. In his book, Justifying Historical Descriptions, C.B. McCullough lists 6 tests that historians use to determine the best explanation for a given historical fact. The hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead meets all of these. It has great explanatory scope in that all the facts are addressed by the hypothesis of the resurrection. It has great explanatory power because the resurrection hypothesis explains each fact well without ambiguity or forcing the issue. It is plausible given the historical context of Jesus' own life, claims, and teachings. And so the resurrection merely serves as the divine confirmation of those claims. It's not ad hoc or contrived, for it only requires an additional hypothesis that God exists, which I take to be established by the arguments of natural theology. It's also in accordance with accepted beliefs. The hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead is not in conflict with the belief that people don't rise from the dead naturally. I accept that belief as much as I accept the hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead. It outperforms its rival theories in meeting the first 5 conditions. And so on the basis of what I've said tonight, I think the best explanation of the facts is the one that the early eyewitnesses gave, that God raised Jesus from the grave. If Nathaniel is to carry tonight's debate, he must first tear down the resurrection hypothesis and raise his own argument that explains the facts better than the resurrection hypothesis. He cannot simply stand up here tonight and give a glorified "nuh-uh." If Nathaniel fails to tear down the argument and provide a better hypothesis, all here, and I say this with respect, including Nathaniel, should give serious consideration to the affirmative case for Jesus rising from the grave, and even more serious, give consideration to Christianity. Thank you.
I saw that Claremore is hosting a Answering Skeptics seminar on October 14th. And I kind of want to come back up here and see how to answer people like me. I'd first like to thank Jennifer and the amazing team there at the SSA here at Rogers State University. Actually, the Hillcats down in Texas, we have the Bearcats. I don't know what a Hillcat is. I honestly have no idea. But apparently you guys were good at basketball last year, so congratulations. The SSA plays a valuable role in the lives of many secular students and young adults across the country. And it is my hope that you continue to grow and create leaders in your communities and in local and state governments. Thank you again. Jennifer, I have a couple of questions for you, if that's okay?
Yeah,
Okay. What year are you?
I'm a senior.
Right? When do you graduate?
Next year in May.
All right. What is your projected career path?
Forensic psychology.
All right. And what did you have for dinner last night?
Chips Ahoy cereal.
All right. Thank you. So from Bart Ehrman, what does it mean, what do historians look for when we are going to figure out something that happened in the past? First off, he says, contemporary accounts close to the time of the events. Then we look for lots of sources. We look for those sources to be consistent with one another, and they must not be biased or skewed toward their own self-interest. Now, I am a fan of mythology. As my good friend Dean can tell you, I really enjoy a riveting story. I'm obviously not the only one. You're all here tonight. The story of Jesus is, at times, incredibly riveting. If you've ever seen any of the cinematic performances of his crucifixion, death, and resurrection, you know how emotionally heavy the entire series of events seems to be. Now, this isn't unique to Jesus. This past Friday, my partner and I went and watched the movie Joker. If you want to see an emotional film, please take the time to sit down and watch. The roller coaster throughout is something to behold, not just with the main character, but also those involved. And side note, I had no idea Robert De Niro was in that film. So, I watch it for him, if nothing else. But stories are not new. They have been inundated in our society since the beginning of time immemorial, since we can write things down. Even before then, we pass down stories. Let's consider Jesus. What are some of the attributes of the story we're discussing this evening? Well, he was stripped, he was beaten, crucified, he died, rose after 3 days, stated that he's going to send Satan, which is undoubtedly the evolution of Hasatan from the Old Testament, right down to hell, and now has a religion named after him that some of you may have heard of. He's also known as the bright morning star, or Venus, and is affectionately called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. This, we are told, is all unique to Christianity. But is it? Are the stories of Jesus really unique? As you can imagine, and because I'm bringing up an example, no. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail regarding a bunch of previous mythologies and gods, but I feel at least a bit of knowledge is pertinent when discussing what to believe. This does not just apply to religion. Let's first consider the Mesopotamian goddess Inanna. How many of you have heard of Inanna? It's fairly what I expected, so good, thank you. Now, how many of you have heard of Ishtar? And what about Aphrodite? That is the same goddess. And by the way, if you want to use that in the future when you're speaking about the Greek mythologies, we can talk about Aphrodite and call her Inanna or Ishtar. It's the same person. But what makes her like Jesus, and why would I bring her up? Well, she was stripped, she was crucified, she rose again 3 days later, and sent the shepherd god Tammuz, or Tammuz, to hell. She's also known as Venus, and her Babylonian symbol is a lion. She also had Sumerian religion named after her. Do these similarities mean the Christians borrowed from the story of Inanna to create the story of Jesus? No, not at all. But they certainly knew of the story. She's even mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 8, verse 14, where the Son of Man, and by the way, no, that's not Jesus, no matter what they try to tell you about that verse or anything that happens in Isaiah chapter 53. The Son of Man sees the Israelites mourning the death of Tammuz. This means they knew about the gods and the goddesses. Does this mean they borrowed from the story? No. But it means they knew. It is important again to note that, for the sake of this debate, and only this debate, I am granting the historical authenticity of Jesus, or Yeshua ben Joseph. I'm also granting, for the sake of this debate, that this person was crucified and that he died. I'm also not going to try to convince anybody of some odd swoon theory, although if you would like to talk about it later, I'm open to suggestion. The idea that somebody lived in the past is a wholly unremarkable claim. People live today, people lived in the past. The fact that somebody was crucified is also unremarkable. The Romans, quite good at that, actually. There are even words, excruciating, things like this, that are named specifically because of the crucifixion. But the notion of a God rising from the dead, especially for redemption of a person or people, being unique to Christianity or even Jesus, is simply untrue. Even the author Mark wrote down that people thought Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead. It's not even unique to Jesus in his own book. This was commonplace in ancient mythology, and to give you a couple of more names, Zamaxis, Osiris, Lucian, who I'm surprised you didn't bring up. That's the first time I've been involved in one of these, you didn't bring up Lucian. Or Lucian, however you want to say his name. Said this about what Antagonist had told him: I know a man who came to life more than 20 days after his burial, having attended the fellow both before his death and after he came back to life. This is the same Lucian, by the way, that wrote Christians worship to this day, a man who was crucified. If you're going to take the things that he says historically, you cannot pick and choose those things. But that's not all. Look at Adonis, Romulus, Alcides, Theseus. If you'd like a lengthy list, and not the incorrect list you might see on Bill Maher's movie Religulous, don't watch that movie. I have a long Google Doc with references cited. You come up to me after this, I'll give it to you. And by the way, I learned things in college about sourcing my material. Now, we're often told that people won't die for a lie. We're often told that disciples didn't change their story even upon pain of death. Now, besides the fact that we have no evidence to substantiate this claim because most of the disciples ran away before Jesus was even crucified, let's consider the following. And if it's okay, I'd like to tell you a story, because I like stories. Do you like stories? And actually, I need to make a quick phone call if that's okay. Hey, would you mind coming over here real quick? Hey, thank you. Because stories are important, props are important. I like props. I was in theater. I don't know if you never went to theater, but being a preacher, obviously. And I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened to me very recently. And to do this, I need the one that was involved. Now, I own corgis. Own them, I think, is a word I'm not going to use. Stanley, come. This is Stanley Ipkiss and Betty Barkington. Yeah, that's fine. Come here. There you go. There you go. Okay, come here. Recently, I was hanging out with Benny Barkington, and we live in an apartment in Arlington, Texas. I think you're just going to walk around, I suppose. And I went to take Benny downstairs because he had to go outside. He was supposed to stay up here with me. We practiced this. It didn't work out. Well, we had to go downstairs, right? It was outside, and we were late at night. And even in Arlington, Texas, late at night, there isn't much traffic. Went downstairs because Benny, the one with the tail, had to go and use the restroom. So he ran down the stairs really quickly, and I followed him down there. And then I said, okay, well, let's get you taken care of. And whenever Benny was done using the bathroom, obviously I could clean the bathroom and everything, and Benny started barking at something, as he will, with the last name Barkington. And I said, Benny, what is going on? Because usually the one that barks is the one without the tail. And he was incredibly aggravated at something. And I wondered what it was. And then I realized that I could see what it was. And I looked very close to my young corgi there, and I saw a triceratops. I don't know if any of you know what a triceratops is. It's a ceratopsian. It's an ornithischian from the Cretaceous period, the Mesozoic era. They are extinct. But I saw a triceratops, and thankfully triceratops was not very hungry at that point. Of course, he wouldn't have eaten me. They're very much plant-eating herbivores, which is means the same thing. And but also apparently also wasn't in the mood to try and run me over or anything either, big rhinoceroses that they are or were. And I know I saw this thing because I was able to reach out and touch it. And I was able to feel its breath, and I was able to see its beak and everything. And I said, I know something very important here. I need to provide evidence. How am I going to provide evidence? The best way to provide evidence is I need to get a picture. And I realized that for the first time and maybe in my life, I didn't have my phone with me. I have two up here. I had none with me at that point. And so I ran back upstairs, leaving Benny with the supposedly extinct dinosaur, and ran back upstairs, came and got my camera, and ran downstairs to try and take a photo of this dinosaur, only to find that the dinosaur was gone. No longer there, neither was Benny acting erratically anymore, much like he does right now. And I searched all over for this dinosaur, knowing that I had seen this dinosaur, knowing that I had experienced this dinosaur, knowing that it was there. And for me, that's a bit of a big deal, because I have fossils strewn about my apartment. This is a real thing. I showed them on video. And so I drove around trying to find this, but could not. Neither could Benny again. I don't actually know where Stanley was in this ordeal. And I went to sleep, and then of course I woke up the next day, and I went and I told my friends. You can go to the Perot Museum in Dallas if you would like. I know some of them. And I told them I had seen this dinosaur. And I said it was an ornithischian, so it was not a modern day dinosaur, but known as birds. But no, it was definitely a triceratops. And my friends asked me for the evidence of it. Did it leave any footprints? No, it didn't leave any footprints. Did it leave any fecal matter? Because you would see that. If you've ever seen Jurassic Park, you know what it looks like. And I said, no, it did not. No footprints, no nothing, could see nothing of this dinosaur. But I know that I saw this dinosaur, and I believe that I saw this dinosaur. And I would tell you that I saw this dinosaur, but to pain of death, to quote The Princess Bride. And I would die telling you that I saw this dinosaur. I believed it. I still believe it to this day. Does that mean that the dinosaur was there? No, it does not. Could have been, but why would you believe me? And also, would you be right to be skeptical of my claim that I saw a dinosaur? Of course you would be. And I can tell you that I would not believe me either. Now I need 4 volunteers, just 4, real quick. Wow. Thank you for the 4 of you that raised your hand. No, you can't.
I was say I didn't think you wanted to.
No.
No.
4. All right. Do I have 4? Okay. How much time do I have left?
Yes, 5 minutes and 45 seconds.
Okay, I'm in good time. I stay with this now. Okay, what was it? 1, 2, 3. So, there you go. Thanks so much. Take that. And then we take those.
They obviously want to say hi.
Absolutely. Just read there. Yeah, absolutely. There you go. And that way everybody gets one.
Nope, stand.
So I would like, what I would like for you to do, and by the way, don't use your neighbors on this, I would like for you to write the questions and answers Jennifer and I did back and forth at the beginning of this. Don't use your neighbors. Please. While they're doing that, I wonder if any of you can do the same. Because everybody in here is an eyewitness to our conversation just 10, 15 minutes ago. we should be able to write this down very easily. Much easier, of course, than let's say something decades later by second, third, fourth, fifth-hand accounts by nobody that was an eyewitness. We're talking Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Or if you would like some of the 36 other Gospels, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Acts of Peter, my personal favorites, the Thomas, who, by the way, you like Thomas as well,
Well, he's got some pretty funny
huh?
stuff.
Yes, he does. Call it funny if you would like. But I think the Apocalypse of Peter is more of the mythology side, I think you would agree. The walking, talking cross? Yes. Whenever you're done, please let me know so I can collect those. Thank you. Because I think this is really important. I think that hopefully you can see kind of where I'm going with this. How'd you do? Because you know words pretty well, right? Yeah.
That's a bias.
There you go. There you go. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. This is just like back in school. All right. I'd like to thank Matthew, Mark, Marjorie, and Jonah for your, there you go, your senior, your major, English, career path, forensic psychologist, and dinner last night, cereal. So close, except I didn't ask, I don't think what your major was. No. I appreciate this one, which is simply 3 questions. When are you graduating spring 2020, major, and what are your plans after graduation? Don't know. Covered dinner last night, what is your year? This one is the closest. And yet, nobody got all 4 questions and all 4 answers. And yet, you would say that you know her, right? I don't know which one is yours, so I'm not going to do that to you. How can we expect something if somebody doesn't know, if they don't know something 10 minutes from now from the exact source sitting there? Now, I understand, obviously, it's somebody coming back from the dead, which is only reported, by the way. It doesn't matter if somebody talks about it in the year 111, or if somebody speaks about it. The only thing we have from the first century at all is a little piece of parchment about this large. It doesn't matter if somebody talks about it. This happened from, right, the source is sitting in the front row. This was 10 minutes ago. And yet, not a single person, even though they know her well, could get that right. How can you expect to see something from not just 4, but any of the other 36 Gospels to get it right either? And Dean, I don't give a damn whether Jesus lived or not. We can talk about that at a different time. All right? We could have a debate about that, but that's not going to happen tonight. Jesus died. That's cool and everything. And here you go. You want those? There you go. I forgot one of those. And I was going to respond to something else, but I'm pretty much out of time. And I really appreciate being up here, Dean. This has been a good time. Thank you very much.
Do you want a dog? Ben, sit. Ben.
12?
Yes,
12
minutes. Time to start when you start.
In my opening speech, I claimed or said that I was going to defend 2 propositions tonight. One, that there was there were 3 facts that must be adequately understood and delineated by a historical hypothesis. And 2, the best explanation of those facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. Once again, those facts are that Jesus died by crucifixion. Shortly after Jesus' death, his disciples proclaimed and believed that they saw Jesus rise from the dead. And number 3, that Paul, an enemy of the church, several years after Jesus' death, had an experience in which he believed he saw the risen Jesus. Now, I think it's great that Nathaniel agrees with me on fact 1. And I would welcome that conversation about Jesus being a person of history, because if he died on the cross, then he's a person of history. And to another point, it's interesting that Nathaniel says, for the sake of tonight's conversation, he'll accept that, which leads me to believe that outside of this conversation, he doesn't believe that, which would put him on the fringe of scholarship. Now let's look. Notice also that he didn't specifically address facts 2 or facts 3. He didn't dispute those. He simply said things like, we can't trust eyewitness testimony. He said things like the method of Bart Ehrman. He only mentioned one that Ehrman states, which is that they shouldn't be biased. Well, guess what? Every historian is biased. Every historian in antiquity and today is biased. Ronald Reagan gives one sentence to his divorce, where other biographers give whole paragraphs to his divorce. So that's just a skewed part of Ehrman's methodology. That's nothing to indict the resurrection. But also, we do have good eyewitness testimony. Nathaniel didn't mention anything about the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and to disprove that that was an early oral creed passed down to Paul and given to other people. He didn't mention anything about Romans chapter 1. That creed being an early oral creed. He simply bypassed it and didn't mention it. I would like for him to address that. How does he know that those aren't early eyewitness testimonies? And what information does he have to go against the case I laid out for them? He didn't address that in his opening position. I don't think that he can address it in his rebuttal. He mentioned the Joker in passing. Okay, everybody who has ever done a film about the Joker, done a comic about the Joker, has admitted that the Joker is fictitious. Jesus is a person of history. It's not analogous at all. Also, he says, that Israel and the New Testament characters knew about these gods. Well, okay, just because they know them doesn't mean that they necessarily copied from them. Knowing something doesn't mean that you've copied from something. And what's interesting is Nathaniel actually agrees with me about the Old Testament. When Nathaniel said about these ancient Near East dying and rising gods, it's confirmed in the Old Testament that yes, the Israelites did know about these dying and rising gods, and they're mentioned in there, which seems to me, it may be a completely different debate, I think it is, but I'm glad that Nathaniel affirms pieces of the Old Testament being historically accurate. I think that's a great point that he makes there, and so I'm glad that he agrees with me on that. He says we don't have any evidence of early disciples dying. The vast majority of historians, specifically New Testament historians, would say that Peter died in Rome. The vast majority of New Testament scholars and historians would say that Paul died as well. So those are at least two pieces of evidence there for early disciples or apostles dying for what they believe. I simply said that their death indicates the sincerity of the belief. Sincerity of the belief doesn't prove the belief. I appreciate, with all due respect, the dog and pony show. That was very, very well done, very creative. Also, one thing that we should understand with the demonstration that was taking place here with the 3 or 4 people here is that the culture of today is different than the culture of then. The culture then was a strictly oral culture. By the age of 12, Jewish boys could memorize the Torah. That is not the case today. So you can't take the culture of today and bind it on the culture of yesteryear. So there's that point. Also, a group of eyewitnesses could complete a uniform list even if a single individual cannot. Even if a single individual cannot, a group can. This is how cops put people away for murder. They separate the eyewitnesses and they say, hey, what did you see? What did you see? What did you see? And just because person 1 over here gets everything but one thing wrong, and people over here get everything but 3 things wrong, what do the cops do? They say, hey, he got this piece right, this person got that piece right, this person got that piece right. It seems like the person who committed the murder committed the murder. That's just good police work. And what we have in the New Testament is exactly that. We have, good police work being done by the authors. Notice again, he didn't address anything about the nature of the appearances in the Gospels. He didn't mention anything about the 500. He didn't mention anything about Jesus and the 7 of the Sea of Galilee. He didn't mention anything about Thomas. Once again, he simply bypassed that and said, hey, you just can't trust eyewitness reports. But once again, a group of eyewitnesses can complete a uniform list with a single eyewitness, even if a single eyewitness couldn't. Also, I think he's trying to use what took place over here as an analogy for the eyewitnesses in the Gospels, but there's a problem with that, is that here, with this piece, this illustration over here, that was strictly auditory. What do you remember audibly, whereas the disciples would have remembered the death of somebody. People are more prone to remember the death of a loved one rather than just hearing about the death of a loved one or somebody and the details with regards to that. Now let's move to the rising and dying gods in general. T.D. Mettinger states the following. There is now what amounts to a scholarly consensus against the appropriateness of the concept of dying and rising gods in the ancient Near East world. Those who still think differently, and this is them being compared to the story of Jesus, those who still think differently are looked upon as a residual member of an almost extinct species. The result of my investigation led me to challenge this scholarly consensus and to disagree with a number of colleagues whom I greatly esteem. And so he gives the reasons why he does that. The world of ancient Near East religions actually knew a number of deities. I agree with that. The gods that die and rise, notice this, have close ties. Just about every god that he mentioned has close ties to the seasonal cycle of plant life. They are closely connected to the seasons. Jesus explicitly is not connected to agriculture. It's a false analogy. And to rely upon that is what Mettinger says puts somebody in the class of an extinct, almost extinct species. Also, the reason that the dying and rising gods analogy would not work is that by the time of the 1st century, there are certain changes that took place within the Jewish culture, and Christianity has Jewish roots, which means what? One, as we stated already, they are an oral culture, but two, the biggest difference between the Jews during the time of the Old Testament and the Jews of the 1st century is that in the Old Testament, I would agree with Nathaniel, maybe to this point, that the Jews had a propensity to accept foreign gods and adapt foreign gods, whereas in the New Testament, what are they doing? They are in rebellion against Rome because they don't want to adopt their gods. They don't want to adopt their gods. And so that is significant when we talk about this comparison between dying and rising gods. Let me give you an example of just how out of whack this tends to get. Let's go with the example that he raised with Osiris. There are a lot of, this is a popular one that states Osiris was some type of Christ figure that died and was raised from the grave. Now, what we know about Osiris is that there's no evidence that Osiris had some type of Eucharist ceremony in which his flesh was eaten in the form of communion cakes. There's the claim that Osiris taught many of the same things as Jesus. There's no evidence of that either. Osiris is the brother of Seth. Seth convinces Osiris to get into a coffin. He gets into the coffin. Seth sends the coffin. He drowns Osiris. Isis comes back, he cuts Osiris into 14 pieces, sends him on his way and scatters him throughout the earth. Isis, as she's grieved, goes and finds him, resuscitates him, and he takes the role of the god of the underworld. Sounds nothing like what we see in the gospel narrative. Sounds nothing like what Paul talks about in the accepted Pauline letters. Sounds nothing like what we see in the oral creeds. This is just an atheist meme that runs around on the internet. Has no ties, no connections to Jesus. What else? I think that I have addressed everything that that Nathaniel has raised. So in conclusion, with the minute that I have left, just notice the facts that he did not address with regards to facts 2 and 3. He temporarily agreed with fact 1 just for the sake of the debate. He didn't address anything about the appearances. He didn't address anything in his opening statement about the creeds. And we've seen clearly from scholarship that the connection between the dying and rising gods is just not there. So I think that my first 3 facts hold. My first argument holds. My second argument holds. And with that, I yield back to Nathaniel.
You want me to take him?
Sorry.
Hey, Dean, I'm not going to respond to your opening statement and my opening statement. Cool. I hope that's okay in future debates when we do this again. But I'd like to respond now, because it'd be difficult for me to write 20 minutes of opening statement responding to your 20-minute opening statement while I'm sitting over there. So the best explanation for what you call facts are that God did it.
Can I get my pen real quick?
Yeah, it's yours? Cool. I was wondering what I was going to give off one of mine.
That's a good catch.
All right, did the apostles suffer and die? Well, we have what's known as tradition. What is tradition? Except something that is passed down from person to person to person, oral traditions. Now, if you think that oral traditions are things that we simply can't memorize today, you've never been inside of a mosque. Susan and I had the opportunity to go to a mosque after the horrific terrorist attack in New Zealand, and you know what we found out? Is that Muslims on a very regular basis memorize the entire Quran, the entire thing. And they are not shy about telling it to you in Arabic. Now, with that being said, they could have been saying anything to me, but I'm going to believe that they were speaking knowing what the Quran says. So to say that people wouldn't be able to remember something from somebody that they know 10 minutes ago, and yes, I agree with you, it's not some sort of psychological trauma or something like that, but to remember these things from somebody that I know, or somebody that I've gotten to know, if Susan were to tell me things, or to mention things, I'd remember them 10 minutes later. But to say that they died, well, we have the Bible. Now, what is the Bible? Gesundheit. What is the Bible? It's a wonderful religious book full of claims. And I have attempted to have the conversation with Dean before that the Bible, much like the Quran and much like every other book, even those of the Zoroastrians, is simply a book of claims. We must look outside of the Bible, which is why I don't respond to biblical claims. The Bible says that Jesus appeared to 500 people. Well, Paul said that. I'm going to do a Ken Ham. Was Paul there? No, Paul heard it from somebody else through a creed. That came from somebody else, that came from somebody else, and nobody has any idea where the creed actually started. He was simply writing down things that he had heard before. He wasn't there. How did Paul die? Well, we have to go to Clement, right, for that? Clement speaks about that. It said that Paul was killed in Rome. But did it say that he was killed because he wouldn't recant for his faith? No. In fact, it said that he was killed because he was blamed for the fire that was set in Rome. So was Peter. The outstretched arms things has nothing to do with the cross. Certainly has nothing to do with something that was upside down. But there's nothing in there that says these. In fact, if you read Pliny the Younger in 111, he specifically states that he had, for as much as he writes about the Christians, he specifically says that he had never actually ever interrogated a single one of them. So he's actually writing things that about a group of people, saying that yes, these group of people exist, but they certainly didn't see them as an actual religious, anything more than a political, possible alternative to what's going on in Rome. And to say, of course, that the Romans, that they wouldn't accept the Romans. I mean, the Romans at this point were accepting everything. Look at Zoroastrians. The Zoroastrians, by the way, are the best example of, and by the way, whenever I brought these things up, I didn't say that they copied them. And in fact, I even specifically stated, Dean, and I thought that you would have heard that while I was saying it, that it doesn't mean they copied them. It simply means that the dying and rising gods were something that they would have heard of before. That is what I said very specifically. But they had heard that the Zoroastrians, the pagan religion from the Sumerians, they had heard about this. They were in Rome. The book of Mark may have very well been written in Rome around this same time. Let's not even consider how many other religions were there. The religion of Attis. If you've never heard about that, Attis and Cybele. If you've never looked that up, you wonder why they're following around a bunch of eunuchs. Because somebody is so beautiful that you castrate yourself. Literally, a religion was going around Rome at the exact same time that Christianity was attempting to make itself known. So this is not even close to something that's unique. But again, where do we get the idea that Jesus rose from the grave? Where is it mentioned at all anywhere else outside of the Bible? The correct answer is nowhere. Where is the 500 mentioned? Nowhere. Paul, and we've had this discussion more than once, and you're always wrong about it. Paul never saw a physical resurrected Jesus, and he made that very clear all throughout his writings. He had visions. I've gone through this more than once, and I've spoken about it in detail. And yes, I'll take Richard Carrier's stance on this. That Paul was a schizotypal who saw visions. I mean, he did see visions. What do we call that today if you see a vision? Do we think that you're a prophet of God? No. We say you see visions and you hallucinate. Especially when you consider in the book of Galatians where he says he went up to the third level of heaven. Does the third level of heaven even exist? It depends which religion you follow. And also, as Bart Ehrman says, how does all this, when we look at all of this, I can't take the gospel seriously anyway, because when I want to ask a question about what day did Jesus die, what time did he die, who all went to the tomb, was the tomb even there, was it Joseph of Arimathea, which we don't even know that person even existed at all. It depends which gospel you read. And if I can't take the gospel seriously, why am I going to take the idea that the gospel of the Bible should be some sort of perfect document that I can get history from? It's not a history book. In any way it's a history book. The genealogies of Jesus by themselves are completely out of whack. The creed, again, you know who else has a creed? The Mormons. They have a wonderful creed. Spoken to. And you know what? And a lot of people that were even in Joseph Smith's life, his part of his family left the church. You know what they never did? They never recanted. Not even one time. Does that mean that Mormonism is the one true faith? It's a good question to ask. I know plenty of Mormons. They think it is. Me mentioning the book of Ezekiel, by the way, and the book of Isaiah doesn't mean that I believe it. I just simply mention it because we have to be talking about Jesus, and Jesus is mentioned in the Bible. If you come through and you have people lined up and you give testimony to the police, they don't take bits and pieces of your testimony. If your testimony is contradictory, they throw it out. They don't use it. I only, by the way, said that Osiris was one of the plethora of dying and rising gods. And I'm going to ask you to not make it seem as though I'm saying things I'm not. Osiris was one of, again, many dying and rising gods. He has many stories about how he died and rose again. We can talk about Romulus, who was like, and how 72, the number comes up in not just Christianity, but also the story of Romulus. How many people condemned Romulus to death? And then we can look at Islam as well. How many virgins do you supposedly get? These numbers they're in so many different religions. But again, Jesus died on a cross. Unremarkable. Jesus was maybe buried somewhere. Unremarkable. Rising from the dead. If a body disappeared today, I'm not saying this happened, but we had this conversation in April. If a body disappeared today, you would not say, oh my gosh, it's Jesus. You wouldn't say it automatically rose from the dead. If a body disappeared today and it was somebody that you love, Dean, you would go and say, who took the body? Where's the body at? You wouldn't automatically say, this body rose from the grave. And again, this is not something I'm saying happens, but People don't just automatically say, and again, when there's zero, period, ever examples of anybody ever rising from the dead, even though there are a plethora of mythology saying this is the case, you don't actually say somebody rose from the dead. In fact, if you look in the book of Matthew, only Matthew is the only one that ever says, without anybody even there, that a bunch of Jewish Sanhedrin got together and said, let's tell them somebody stole the body. Nobody was even around for that conversation. It's like Jesus talking to himself when he's on the freaking mountain. Who records these things? It's like Moses writing his own death in Deuteronomy. It's nonsense. Yeah, I think that's a good way to end that. Thank you.
Is that what?
Yeah,
Okay.
8 minutes.
I'll make sure I keep my pen over here. I know you're not going to take it. I just want to interrupt you for a pen. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I have these in order. All right, as I stated in my opening, that I was going to defend two major arguments. The first argument being that there are three facts that must be adequately answered by any historical hypothesis, and those facts were that Jesus rose, or Jesus died by crucifixion. Shortly after that, the disciples had experiences in which they saw Jesus, and then Paul, an enemy of the church, converted to Christianity after having an experience in which he believed he saw the risen Jesus. Now, if you notice, what Nathaniel did here is quite interesting. Preliminary issues before I really go, I'd like to say, hard and faint. Number one, I didn't mention Pliny the Younger in my opening statement. I mentioned Tacitus. Also, I agree with Nathaniel that the Jews in the Old Testament had heard of these gods. That's all I said. Also, when it comes to the dying and rising gods, I just used Osiris as an example for the whole, and then cited scholarly work on the connection between the dying and rising gods and why they don't work. Nathaniel just simply doubled down on what he said in his opening statement with regards to the dying and rising gods. Also, it should also be noted, Nathaniel mentioned the empty tomb. While I find that to be an interesting topic for another time, that was not a part of my first three facts. So what's going on at this point is Nathaniel is mentioning things to support his argument that I didn't even bring into the argument. I didn't bring into the argument Pliny the Younger. I didn't bring into the argument the empty tomb. And I agreed with him about the Jews knowing of these Old Testament gods. Now, he does attack Paul, fact number 3, and said that Paul said that he didn't see a physical body. Now, what's interesting here is that there are two lines of attack that Nathaniel uses. He says that he didn't appear, or Paul didn't believe that he saw a real body. So let's just look at this for a second. Jakob Claremore translated the verb appear, translates the verb appear as appeared or let himself be seen, and says we cannot deny a visual element to the verb, since throughout the prophets and the New Testament it clearly has the function, and he concludes that this verb signifies, just as it did in the Old Testament, the power characteristics of Yahweh and the angels to appear visibly, and he ascribes that same property to the resurrected Jesus that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15. So Paul says he appeared in a physical form to me, which I find interesting that Nathaniel would raise that idea. Furthermore, the illustration used by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is that of a seed that is sown and then reborn. And he mentions in 1 Corinthians 15, he's answering the question, what about the physical body of Christians? What's going to happen with the physical body of Christians? And he says, just as the seed is sown and dies and is reborn, the body is sown as a physical body and will also be raised. That same physical body will be raised and transformed. Romans 8:11, I would describe you there, that he mentions the physical body. In Philippians, he mentions the physical resurrection and the transformation of the physical body, not to something that is, ghost-like or anything like that. That simply is outside of the Pauline corpus, and that is outside of New Testament scholarship. As Gordon Fee points out, attempts to make the stand for a vision rather than an actual appearance are either irrelevant or simply prejudicial, since it means Christ visibly appeared to people. Paul believes that he saw a real body. Also, when we look closer and we look at what Nathaniel said about the Bible, that the Bible is the claim, not the evidence, essentially what Nathaniel is saying is all claims about Jesus found in the Bible don't count because all claims about Jesus are found in the Bible. That's circular reasoning. And so how does that follow logically? Think about this for a second. If someone is murdered and a note is left which makes a claim about the motive, the makeup of the murder, or clues about when and where the next murder will happen, will the detective say the following? Well, boys, we can't use this note because the claims about the murderer are contained in the letter about the murderer. No, that will not happen. This seems preposterous. History is done by assessing claims of sources who make claims about important people and events. Notice in my opening statement that I said, just as Romans will use Roman sources to figure out things about Rome, or historians will, and just as historians will use sources from the Union and the Confederacy to figure out what happened in the Civil War, why is it we can't do the same thing with the New Testament? That's the question that Nathaniel needs to answer, and his answer can't be, well, because it's in the Bible. That's just a prejudice towards the Bible. That's all that is. What else? So we see here also, as far as, the creed, the oral creed, he just said that the creed was passed down from one person to another person to another person to another person. He never addressed the specificity of my claim. The specificity of my claim is that creed is within 5 years of the death of Jesus. That creed is not 70 years after the death of Jesus. If Paul visited Rome or Jerusalem in AD 36 and he got the creed in AD 36, that means the creed was around before, you guessed it, AD 36. So the creed is early as well. And so one other point that needs to be made here, that I'll move towards, once again about the physical body that Nathaniel mentioned, just came to my attention. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is clearly speaking of an intrinsic change, not an exchange. So the word change in the New Testament can mean either an intrinsic change of the body or an exchange, like I exchanged money at the airport versus, my, you look older than you were 50 years ago. So the verb has the same range of meaning. So Paul's mentioning this in Romans 1:23. Paul says they exchanged the glory of God for images. In 1 Corinthians, Paul never says, well, we shall change bodies. He doesn't use it in the sense of, I'm going to exchange one body for another. He uses it in the sense that my body, my physical body that dies, will be changed. So that is the ending of my rebuttal, and I think my facts still hold.
You want me to seriously examine the claims of the Bible? Give me some contemporary extra-biblical evidence, and then I will. Until then, they are claims, nothing more. That's how that works. Sure, you can leave me a note. I'm going to go look at what's written on the note. I'm going to try and find evidence for the stuff that's written on the note. If I can't find the evidence on the note, what am I going to do with that note? You think I'm going to take it seriously? No. I'm going to do something tonight that I said that I wasn't going to do. And I apologize. Because I like to stick to my word. But I'm going to read from the Bible. And I'm going to read from Galatians chapter 1. Paul says this, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me that I might preach him among the Gentiles, my immediate response was not to consult any human being. Now, I don't know how you would read that, but it seems like revelation to me. Not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man. How can you say he saw somebody? Or that the person that he saw was a physical being? Acts chapter 9. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, what the man? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus whom they are persecuting. Now get up and go in the city. You'll be told what you must do. Now the men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound but did not see anyone. Paul got up off the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by hand. He went to Damascus, and then where he was there for 3 days and didn't eat anything. Which is great. Except for you read in Acts chapter 22, now those who were with me saw the light, but did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. Which one is it, Dean? Chapter 9 or chapter 22? And which one is it, Dean? Did he get it by revelation, or did he get it from a person that he could touch? And actually at that point, does it matter if Jesus was touched or not? Because that depends which gospel you read. I can't take the Bible seriously, so I have to look extra biblically. And when I look extra biblically, do you know what I find? Nothing. There's nothing in the first century at all. And the average lifespan of a person in the first century was less than 50. So you're telling me that somebody who's alive, and by the way, they came from Galilee, and even though we need to teach Mark some geography lessons about where Galilee is, they came from Galilee when they were in their 30s, because the book of John can be, which is my favorite gospel, by the way, it really is, of the ones that are in the Bible. It can be summed up in like 3 months. It really can. The things that Jesus said in there can be done in less than 3 months. It wasn't necessarily in 3 years. But you tell me that 33 years old, they would have lived another 20 years. Yeah, they may have had something around saying we saw these things. But at the point the Gospels were written some 40 and 60 and 80 years later, how many people was it passed on to? We've already read the Gospels. We know that they contain contradictory accounts by themselves. But if that comes to the case, that it depends which one that I read, then should I really take it seriously? Should I at all? Especially if somebody like Paul is saying, some of you follow John the Baptist, some of you follow Jesus, some of you follow me. And this is within, 20 years after the supposed death and resurrection of Jesus. That's already happening. You're seeing a fracturing of the church at that point. We already know that how many books, 1st and 2nd Peter, are you serious? Those were books, how many books that even claim to be written by Paul in the New Testament weren't even written by him. But you want me to take the writings in there seriously and to look at, there's nothing, 0 people in the 1st century out of one piece of parchment. There's only one person in the New Testament. One person who ever said, I personally saw the risen Jesus. And that person was Paul. And the stories of that are contradictory in the same book. If that's the case, then how can I take anything that was said about anything in the Bible seriously? I don't know that I could. And I once did, as a Christian. And I implore you to read that the same way that I did, and not with an apologetics lens on. Snicker, snicker. Because it is important that we do that. I want to do things that my friend, and I'm happy to say that Susan is a better friend of Matt Dillahunty's than I am, and is very jealous, but I'm a better friend of Ardra than you, so we'll take that. Matt Dillahunty says, I want to believe as many true things as possible. I want to. Convince me that this stuff is real. And I'll believe it. It doesn't mean that I'll be a Christian, but I'll certainly believe the Bible. But you've got to provide something more than anecdotes and something that somebody said that I apparently am an extinct creature, much like the Triceratops that I promise I saw. Thank you.
Five minutes, correct?
5 minutes.
In tonight's debate, I defended 2 main arguments: that there are 3 facts that must be answered by an adequate historical hypothesis. That Jesus died by crucifixion. Shortly after his death, the disciples believed and proclaimed they had seen the risen Jesus. And then within a few years after his death, Paul, an enemy of the church, was converted to Christianity after having an experience which he believed the resurrection of Jesus. Then 2, that God raised Jesus from the dead is the best explanation of these facts. Now, a couple of preliminary things before I get to my closing. Nathaniel mentioned that Paul might have been schizotypal in his rebuttal, except there's a problem there because the Harvard Medical Journal notes that schizotypals are people who have extreme anxiety, they're people who are non-social, have trouble maintaining and creating a relationship. As we look in the accepted letters of Paul, that does not seem to be the case for Paul. So that is simply a ad hoc response to fact number 3. Also, Nathaniel raised the objection about Paul having a revelation instead of getting something handed down from a person, as that's some type of contradiction in Galatians. The problem with that is it simply doesn't matter what Paul received by revelation. He could have received multiple things by revelation. My case is that 1 Corinthians 15 is an oral creed that he handed down. And still, Nathaniel has not adequately shown why that's not an oral creed. He hasn't done it, and I don't think that he can. He mentioned Paul's conversion accounts in Acts. Once again, as with his rebuttal, my case is not built on Acts. My case is built on the accepted letters of Paul that both conservative and liberal scholars accept. Now, if Nathaniel wants to bring in Acts, my question is, does Nathaniel accept the speech sections that are early in Acts, like in Acts chapter 2, where Peter talks about the life and the death and the appearances of Jesus, or Peter's other sermon in Acts chapter 4, or Paul's other sermons that talk about the death and the resurrection of Jesus? If he's going to bring in the supposed contradictions in Acts 9 and Acts 22 and the other section in Acts, then he should accept the other speech sections that are also in Acts in order to be consistent with his argumentation. Now, to the point that he raised about Acts, what we see in Acts chapter 9 is that hearing here is used in the genitive case, which denotes that a sound was heard. The difference between that and Acts chapter 22 is that hearing takes the accusative case, which in Greek indicates that a sound was heard but not completely understood. And so there was in the extent of what was being said and the understanding of what was being said was not understood. Therefore, given the Greek manuscripts and guys like A.T. Robertson, who's the prince of Greek, delineating Greek, there is no contradiction here. There just isn't. And so tonight, I have provided what I believe to be good evidence that the best explanation of the facts are. That once again, Nathaniel's answer to these do not have good explanatory scope, do not have good explanatory power. They are not plausible given what we know about things of schizotypals and things like that. Most of the explanations that Nathaniel gives are ad hoc. And so I think that the resurrection case stands. He stated that Paul didn't believe in a physical resurrection. We handled that in 1 Corinthians 15. Nathaniel noted, raising the issue of Paul being schizotypal. He mentioned gospel reliability. That's not the debate tonight. And even in the way that I'm approaching the Gospels as Greco-Roman biographies, there could still be, and I'm not saying that there are, but there could be contradictions within a text, yet still a historical core be there. That's how history is done. And so tonight's debate is not about gospel reliability. Once again, if he wants to have that conversation, we can have that conversation. But the facts still remain. The resurrection hypothesis is the best explanation of the facts. And Nathaniel has not torn down that argument, and he hasn't even raised his own hypothesis about how to explain these facts throughout the entire night. Therefore, since Nathaniel cannot do either one of those, the resurrection hypothesis stands. Thank you.
Name I didn't recognize. All right, so why are we here tonight? Discuss whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. Came up here and presented the exact same thing that I thought he was going to present, because for the last 2,000 years, although a little bit of hedging has been done, they haven't brought up anything new. Because there's nothing new to bring up. Because there's the Bible. And by the way, I bring up the book of Acts. It doesn't mean I believe that nonsense. I mean, it's the contradictions in there. By the way, Daniel B. Wallace, the famous Greek scholar, completely disagrees with you regarding the supposed contradictory language in the book of Acts. So if you're going to bring up just arguments with authority, there's one for you. I don't believe that nonsense. Handling snakes and all that? No. That's in your book, not mine. We talk about what is the most plausible scenario? that Jesus was crucified and tossed into a mass grave. That's it. That is the most plausible. We talk about probability. Right? I do science. This is what we talk about. We talk about probabilities. How many people in the history of our world have risen from the dead? 0. I appreciate the answer. 0. So we talk about probability. Let's consider it. Jesus was crucified and died on the cross, which again, I don't address your 2 points because that was what I was conceding for the sake of this debate. And yes, I would love to debate the gospel sometime. I should know the gospels that are in the resurrection of Jesus. That would be great. We should do that.
Set it up.
Like Texas State University in St. Marcus.
Set it up.
That doesn't happen. What would Romans do? They would crucify people every single day, and they would do it in Jerusalem every single day. And it wasn't just done on some hill named Golgotha. It was everywhere. They did it all the time. Pontius Pilate, even the weakling that he was considering, what everybody was around him, especially those in Syria, would still do it all the time. You know what they would do? They would toss people in mass graves. That's the most plausible scenario. Now, if I'm following somebody around for supposedly 3 or 4 years, and I'm saying that they're supposedly doing miracles, even though I forgot the loaves and the fish more than once because I was surprised he was able to do it again, okay. If I'm doing that for the past 3 years, I don't want people to think that what I've seen with the person that I'm following, even though if I could look in the Essenes and look at what the Maccabees are saying about what we expected this God to be was to be somebody that brought us out of the persecution of the Romans, maybe I don't, and the only people that are mentioned, by the way, yeah, we went over this last time. The only people that are mentioned are Cephas, right? And James, the supposed brother of Jesus. So by the way, if you are the brother of a God, you believe he is a God. That is the way that goes. And in fact, they might not have actually been James, the brother of Jesus, that we're talking about. We can get into a million things there. But the most plausible explanation when somebody is crucified is that they die. Are there stories that are made up of a plethora of dying and rising gods? Yes. Does it mean that any of them are true? And why don't you accept any of those? Because there is just as much evidence that Osiris, that Zalmoxis, that Romulus, that oh my gosh, I could go in now on so how many different gods supposedly died and rose from the grave, even 3 days later. And you accept none of those, even though they have the exact same amount of evidence of Jesus rising from the dead. And yes, Paul very specifically said that he got it from Revelation. Does Revelation mean something different to you than it does to me? I don't think so. But I think the only thing you could possibly take from this entire debate, at any point that you ever read these things critically, which again I do recommend, is that sure, Jesus could have lived. Jesus could have been what's seen as a political adversary to the Romans, and even to the Jews in the Sanhedrin, but certainly not the Pharisees, and that this could have happened. And that then a person would have been crucified. Yes. But to say somebody rose from the dead, I don't know how you could actually jump to that conclusion regardless of what Dina said tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys very much. Let's give another round of applause to our speakers. Very impressed. Thank you guys very much. We have scheduled just a brief amount of time for questions because I imagine everyone has been here, would like a break and all that, but if you all might stick around for a little bit afterwards too, I'm sure there can be some more conversation.
If I can speak for Nathaniel, sorry, we'll stay as long as y'all want to stay. That's okay with you?
I can sleep on the way home. I'm fine.
Sorry.
What we'll do for our audience members then is we'll take time for just a couple questions, and I apologize for keeping that portion brief, but just for the sake of time for everyone. So if there are any audience questions or comments or points of discussion you'd like to address with our speakers? Yes, sir. We'll do those two. You guys have the first hands up. So.
I'd just like to ask Nathaniel, what happened 2019 years ago?
2019 years ago?
Yes.
I don't know. Neither do you.
Why did the dates change?
Oh, you mean into CE?
Yes.
Sure. This comes from Greco-Roman calendars. And then that seems to be the case because, but there are many other calendars other than the ones we use today. And you're aware of that, right? It just so happens that the people who made the calendars we use today were people in power that they said Jesus was the one, and that was why they did that. But you're even talk, say again?
And you were there and saw that.
No, there's historical evidence that actually happened. And we actually even know when it happened. And if you'd like, I can provide you the extra biblical sources of that. But there's even, you can even say, why did it change at a certain date if he was born in 4 BCE or 7 CE, depending on which gospel you read? Why did it change at 0? Do you know the answer to that?
I'm asking you.
No, well, I don't know. But I know they gave a certain date. But then you look at it and you look at when you read the book of Matthew. Was he born during the time of Herod in 4 BCE? Was he born during the time of Quirinius, like it says in the book of Luke? But they put a certain date on it because they were the Catholic Church, Roman Catholics, were the people that were in charge at that point, and that was the religion that was the most dominant at the time, and still is today. That's why. But now when we look at historians, we don't use BC and AD anymore. BCE and CE, that's the common era. That's the reason why.
Just real quick, to the gentleman's question, Nathaniel is right with regards to the calendar change. However, we need to keep in mind that has no bearing on whether or not the resurrection and the evidence that's been provided tonight is true. So I think it's a neat question, and I think it's a good question, but I don't know that it has any substantive impact on what we've talked about tonight. Good question.
Well, I get why you're asking it though. You did the "were you there" thing, and I understand that. But we actually have evidence as to why it happened. So I appreciate it.
And I believe you had a hand up as well. Yes, ma'am.
My question is for Nathaniel.
Hi.
The story you gave about the dinosaur?
Yes.
Was it a dream or hallucination, or if it was really recorded?
I'm uncertain. It's the same thing that happens to me, and she can attest to this all the time, where I have PTSD. And I wake up in the middle of the night and I don't know where I am. And I see things that I'm certain are there. And I am terrified by what I believe is there. And I turn on the light how many times? And I run across the room not knowing where I'm at sometimes. Does that mean that they were actually there though? I don't know. I mean, I would say that I wouldn't believe me.
Quick follow-up, when you said it's certain they're here, if it's a big dinosaur, it comes through your window, it will break it down or your door?
Yeah, it was outside. So.
Oh, it was outside?
Yeah. I appreciate that. Thank you.
We'll let you have one final question, and we'll maybe break. And I appreciate you all saying you stick around for additional questions and stuff. Yes, sir.
The question is also for Nathaniel. You claim that when he asked this question that we don't know what happened 2,000 years ago, like he doesn't know, you don't know.
Correct.
What's the whole point of this debate and running up your arguments and claims that in the end we don't know?
Sure, because people believe this. People stake their lives on it. People attempt to legislate based on this sometimes. And I want to believe as many true things as possible, and I believe that you do as well. And the purpose of this debate is to, if we're going to believe something, do we have good reasons to do it? Right? And that really, I think, is what it is. And obviously, for you coming here and people that are religious coming here, do I have a firm foundation for the reasons that I believe? And if you don't believe, do I have a firm foundation for why I don't? And should I look into these things? People take nothing more serious than faith. I think I can say that to be, yeah. Would you know, how many times have we seen in not just in the Bible, but extra biblically as well, because people certainly Justin Martyr, the reason that the word martyr exists, right? Because somebody certainly did die. But if we're taking this so seriously, this is the most important things in our lives, shouldn't we know, to the best that we can know something, that what we believe is true?
No, I agree with Nathaniel. As I said in my opening, I don't think that there's a more important question that any of us in this room tonight can answer outside of did Jesus rise from the grave? And so that's why some of the things that we've talked about tonight are so important, because while Nathaniel and I stand on opposite sides. The reason that we're here is because we take these things seriously, and we think, well, I'm not going to speak for Nathaniel, but I think, just the way in which culture is, we don't think about these types of things enough in culture. And then just as a side note, not that I see things like Nathaniel, but there are instances. I have PTSD, or I've suffered from PTSD as well, and my wife can attest. There are nights where I wake up in a sweat and I think that I've been in a firefight. But the interesting thing about that, as it pertains to this conversation and this debate, is that I might have dreamed that I was in a firefight, but my wife cannot share that dream with me. There's no way that I could, or even if I had a good dream, like, hey, I'm surfing in Hawaii, I don't roll over and say, hey babe, why don't you come join me in Hawaii, we need a vacation. Which, the reason I point that out is because with regards to the discussion tonight, and I'll give Nathaniel a chance to respond, it's unclear, is that hallucinations are like dreams in the sense that they can't be shared. They are mind independent with no external referent. So when you have Jesus appearing, or in the early creeds, appearing to Cephas, appearing to the 12, appearing to 500, 500 people statistically do not share the same dream, do not share the same hallucination. So the question becomes, what's the best explanation for those group appearances if hallucinations can't be shared, just like dreams? So I'll let Nathaniel counter that if he wants to.
Group hallucinations aren't rare. It happens. Cardinal cults is a great example of it. But
Perhaps this is a good place for us to end from here, but I appreciate you both being available for more discussion afterwards. Please just give them one more round of applause. Sincerely thank all of you for being here tonight and dedicating your time to this exercise and this debate. It really says a lot to how important people think these discussions are, and I think that that's really good to go here. So I want to thank one last time the Secular Student Alliance for hosting this event, and I believe there's another debate in April.
Yeah, April 23rd is our tentative date. So, and we're trying to get Seth Andrews and the same people who supplied a speaker for us for our last debate.
Oklahoma.
They're coming back to help us.
Oklahoma.
With this.
Get William Lane Craig.
Oh, Seth will hate that.
So I'm going to say you all potentially join us then as well. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you guys for being here.
yeah, thank you.
Seth was a cult guy.
Yeah, he's
Seth
definitely
was by. I had seen that and tried to get him to come tonight. Oh, they're a good point.